We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet to share these conversations on the Vegan Compass podcast.
We extend our respect to elders past and present, as well as any of our listeners and guests. Hello and welcome to the Vegan Compass podcast, unveiling truths, inspiring change. We are your hosts, Rick Allport and Mackenzie Cross.
From wherever you're listening, please be sure to like and subscribe to support this podcast. Now to the episode.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Vegan Compass podcast. As always, we're so excited to have you with us. We really love this community of engaged vegans, animal rights activists, everyone who's interested in the movement. We really appreciate you tuning in. It's just really nice to sort of build this community. And if you're watching on YouTube, you will see that we are wearing our new merch. We have hoodies, t-shirts, tote bags, mugs. We'll put the link in the show notes.
Yep.
If you want to get your hands on some merch, that's a great way to support the show. So thank you so much. Rick, who are we talking to today?
Well, today, this is going to be a really interesting episode. It's something that we haven't delved into before. I'm really fascinated about this whole area. So we have Dana from Animal Free Science Advocacy. So Dana, welcome to the podcast. I'm going to ask you two questions. Who are you and what do you do?
Hi guys, thanks for having me. My name is Dana. I'm a veterinarian and I currently work for an Australian not-for-profit charity called Animal Free Science Advocacy, or AFSA. As the name indicates, AFSA advocates for animal-free science. So specifically, we believe that no animal should be harmed in the name of science, and that scientific progress can be advanced through animal-free research methods that are ethical, human-specific and scientifically valid. And we're the only organisation in Australia advocating exclusively for animals in research and teaching.
That's such important work that you do, because obviously laboratory animals are hidden away. It's something that we don't really know a lot about. But you have an interesting background. You mentioned that you're a vet. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey working as a vet to now becoming a passionate advocate for animal-free science? What did that look like for you?
So I've always wanted to work with animals, and that was something I knew of from a young age. And I didn't want to just work with them. I really wanted to make a difference in their lives and ensure that they had better treatment in this world. And that's what motivated me to pursue vet studies. But I quickly realized that the veterinary world was not the environment that I had imagined. Naturally, I thought I'd be entering a space full of like-minded people who wanted to liberate animals from suffering and saw the cruelty in so much of their treatment across different industries, but it was quite the opposite in reality. And when I made it out of vet school and began working in hospitals, I tried really hard to emphasize with the owners or the guardians of pets, their animals' experience in their lives. But when you're dealing with individuals, it's hard to create change. And so I've always had this itch to try and help animals on a much bigger scale. And I have a special place in my heart for animals that suffer in experiments. So when the opportunity presented, I jumped at it.
It's an amazing thing that you're doing. I do a bit of research into stuff for my work with Vegan Australia, and I see what happens in animal experimentation, and it just absolutely shatters my heart. But was there a specific moment or experience that made you focus on animal experimentation as a priority issue for you?
There wasn't a specific moment or experience, but it was more of an emotional connection. So as the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, I've always been particularly disturbed by the stories of Dr. Mengele and his experiments. To this day, I can't believe that those atrocities actually happened. And something that I read about him recently really resonated with me. It said, his crimes represent the extreme danger posed by science when it is conducted in the service of an ideology that denies the rights, dignity, and humanity of certain groups of people. And this is exactly the situation for animals in research and teaching. They're being subjected to the same kinds of horrific experiments and treatment that these people were, on the grounds that they are less than us, and they have no say in any of it. And there are many animal organizations that exist, but for some reason, animal research is one of those few that rarely get attention. And yet what these animals are going through is one of the worst experiences that exist. As a vet, I've had to train in many fields, including animal slaughter, and I can confidently say that research is arguably the worst kind of existence for an animal.
That's a really, I think, poignant connection between the experiments during the Holocaust and what animals are experiencing in research. I don't think I've ever heard anyone put it like that before, and it really puts it into perspective. And I think that's something that might make a lot of people really connect more with this issue of animal experimentation.
It can be quite controversial in opinion, and some people actually find it offensive, but the reality is that a lot of survivors have seen what goes on in animal agriculture and animal experiments and been reminded of their experiences, their real life experiences in that same setting, which says it all for me.
Can you help us understand the problem a little bit more? Because many people are shocked that animal experimentation is still widespread and still occurs in Australia. So can you really paint the picture for us about what animal use in science really looks like in practice?
Yeah, so animal experimentation takes place all around the world for a variety of industries and purposes. And yes, that does include Australia. And there are several categories of their use. So there's teaching, like medical courses, vet science, psychology courses, etc. There's basic research, which is curiosity driven, like studying a disease. There is applied research, which is looking more at the therapeutics and treatments. And then there's regulatory testing. So that's safety and toxicity testing, like for cosmetics and household items. Now, the actual number of animals used in research in Australia and around the world is unknown because there's no system in place for reporting animal use in this field. But we do know that in Australia, it's in the millions and it's much more worldwide. And there is this whole other industry attached, which is the breeding of animals specifically for use in research. They're often genetically modified, and sometimes animals are taken from the wild. Now, these animals are usually held captive for use in research for their lifetime. So when they finish one study, they're passed on for use in another study until they can no longer be used, which usually means that they've either been so negatively affected by the experiments that they need to be euthanized, or that they died from the experiment itself. Very few of them go on to retire, and even less are rehomed. They spend their lives living miserably in cages, scared, in pain, and they usually die there.
So horrific.
Oh, that's just, it's mind-numbing. It's mind-numbing to think that this can actually happen and we're in the 21st century when we know so much better, and I just don't know why people don't wake up. It drives me crazy. But in saying that, and you say, yes, there's millions of animals in Australia and who knows how many millions across the world in all different conditions. But what kind of animals are mostly used in research, and what does their daily life involve? You've kind of touched on that a little bit, but can you give us some sort of more insight in that?
So the most commonly used species are rats, mice, and rabbits. After that, dogs, cats, and fish. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of testing being done on non-human primates, so monkeys. And there are more, but these are the most common. The daily life of an animal in a research laboratory is pretty grim. And we can divide it into two main components. The first is the experiments, and the second is the captivity. So the experiment itself can vary greatly. For some animals, perhaps those in cosmetic tests, it could be having substances applied to their bodies, which may burn or cause other injuries. And for others, it's more invasive, and it can be anything from having drugs forcefully shoved down your throat to organ transplantation. There are studies that intentionally cause emotional trauma, like the separation of mothers and babies, or forcing animals into depression. And there are even studies that replicate acts of violence, such as intimate partner violence or domestic violence. Obviously, the more invasive the experiment, the more painful and distressing it is for the animals. but all of them cause some degree of pain, distress, trauma, or injury. And that is, after all, exactly what the researchers are trying to test, to see how sick a chemical is going to make us, how distressing something is, and how we handle that stress. So the animals are intentionally being hurt. And some people will say it's not that bad, or they're actually okay because they're under the care of a vet and they're receiving pain relief. That's like saying someone who experienced brain injury through intimate partner violence didn't suffer because they got a paracetamol afterwards. So animals don't understand the research or why they're there. They only know that they're in pain and they're distressed. And then the other part of their lives is the captivity component. So when the animals in research are not being experimented on, they're living in cages or enclosures of sorts, depending on the species. For primates, that cage can be so small they cannot even stand upright. We're also talking steel bars with no proper flooring, within a laboratory, and next to no enrichment. Many of them can also be caged alone with no ability to interact with others. And so they just have to sit there for days or weeks on end, sometimes years, with nothing to do, nowhere to go, no one to talk to, whilst they're also dealing with severe injuries like brain injury, spinal injury, poisoning, disease from deadly viruses. And naturally, many of them go mad and display behaviours typical of anxiety and depression, like self-mutilation or endless circling. It's extremely sad, and they're often kept like this for years, used in experiment after experiment until they either die or they're so ill or injured from the experiment itself that they need to be euthanized. They can even be deprived of food and water because in some experiments, like primate cognition experiments, researchers will use food and water to motivate the animals to perform for them. So each time they perform a task, they're rewarded with a pellet or a sip of water. So even just staying alive between experiments can be torturous. And then the other thing that many people don't think about is that these animals are handled by humans quite intensively. So for many of them, this in itself can be distressing to the point of death. Rabbits, for example, they're so sensitive to stress from handling that they can literally die from it in an instant. Primates are wild animals with a level of consciousness and self-awareness that's really similar to us humans. So the mental impact of their imprisonment is significant. So in short, animals used in research have to endure both the experiment and the captivity, both of which are traumatic and sometimes fatal. So it's really tragic.
It's actually reminded me, there's a podcast that I love. It's an amazing podcast. They've only had one season, but Radicals and Revolutionaries. And it goes back into the history of the animal rights movement predominantly in the United Kingdom. I can see now why these guys would go in and raid these laboratories and try and free these animals, because they just went, no, this has got to stop. We've had enough. And they would try and destroy these laboratories. So if anyone wants to listen to a great podcast, Radicals and Revolutionaries tells the history of the animal rights movement. It's a really fascinating
I loved
listen.
that podcast as well. But you are an absolute wealth of knowledge in this area. And I don't know how you do the work that you do, because I feel traumatized just from listening to all of the horrific things that these animals have to go through. I don't know how you are exposed to that every day. And then on another level, when you put yourself in the shoes of these animals who are having to actually experience this firsthand, it is a crime that this is legal, in my opinion.
Yeah. And we have laws against animal cruelty, but it doesn't work for animals in experimentation or animals in the animal agriculture industry. It's like, oh, cats and dogs, we don't want to touch them. But anyone else, yeah, you're fine. Yeah, we'll do whatever we want.
Meanwhile, cats and dogs are being experimented on in labs.
Yes, exactly, yeah. And people don't even know. So, yes, thank you for coming onto the podcast to make people more aware, and I hope we can help spread this message in what we're doing. But in saying that, what protections, like I don't know that there are any, but what protections, if any, currently exist for animals used in laboratories in Australia?
Yeah, so this is where things get a little bit complicated. So the National Health and Medical Research Council, or NHMRC, have developed what they've called the Australian Code for the Care and Use of Animals for Scientific Purposes, which we refer to as the Code. So the code has been adopted into state and territory legislations in that you need a license to conduct research, and the research has to be approved by an Animal Ethics Committee or an AEC. However, beyond that, there is no other legislation in place offering these animals protections, and the system is highly flawed. At a top level, I would say that there are probably three main problems with it. The first is that Australia follows global principles of the 3 Rs, which is to reduce, refine, and replace animal use in research. But most of the focus is on refinement and reduction, not on replacement, meaning it doesn't question whether the research is ethically or scientifically justified in the first place. The second problem is that the code is designed to safeguard animal welfare, but something that's approved for scientific use can be exempt from all other legislations, even if it would otherwise be considered a criminal offence. An example of this is a series of studies that were recently conducted by Monash University on injuries that were sustained in the context of intimate partner violence. The study quite literally strangled animals and then induced traumatic brain injury by smashing their heads with metal plates. The animals were also babies and received very little pain relief after. And some of the injuries were so severe that the animals needed to be resuscitated. Now, in regular society, this would be considered an animal cruelty offence. And if it were people, it would be considered a violent crime. But within the laboratory, it's all legal because the university had a research license and because the AEC gave it the all clear. Aside from the experiment itself, there are other aspects of animal use and care that the code deems acceptable, which we would argue are not. For example, it permits surgical procedures to be carried out by researchers and other staff who are not veterinarians, which is not allowed outside of the laboratory for obvious reasons. It allows the isolation of animals that are highly social species like primates, which is in itself cruel. It inflicts fatal diseases and many other things that most people wouldn't be comfortable with. And then the third problem is that the entire system is self-regulated with no federal oversight. So whilst there are state legislations that apply to animal research, the only body responsible for assessing whether or not something adheres to the code is the AEC, who have a vested interest in the research and operate under a system where the use of animals in this way is not only accepted, but expected. And then the publications are celebrated. So they have the final say. And since they are the ones responsible for any misconduct or non-compliance, well, of course, they're not going to report themselves. And it shows because there have been very few prosecutions recorded ever, and most relate to licensing bureaucracy. The funding bodies also don't take responsibility for the enforcement of the code. They just delegate to states and territories. And the state government can conduct audits and issue licenses and handle complaints, advise on best practice, things like that. But the final say still goes back to the AEC. So in short, it's a self-regulated system lacking any enforceable legislation and any objective oversight, which is problematic on so many levels, but ultimately fails to protect these animals.
Yeah, that is so wrong. And then it falls into the hands of a charity organisation like you guys to be revealing all of these horrific things that go unchecked.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. It's just...
This is a really heavy episode.
It is a heavy episode, but it's an episode that I think everybody in the world needs to hear. We need to have this information put in the face of everybody and like forcibly put in the face of everybody because it's horrific what's going on. But we know that animal-based research often fails to translate to human outcomes. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, so many people say that they feel okay about animal research because it's serving what they believe to be a higher purpose and benefiting the greater good, that being advancing human health. But the data actually shows us otherwise. If we look at drug development testing, for example, and that's where animals are given a newer experimental drug to assess its toxicity and basic safety and how it behaves in the body before it's actually given to people. This is a step that is required in most countries in drug development. We know that around 92% of drugs that pass preclinical animal testing go on to fail in human trials. meaning that the drugs behave differently in humans and have unexpected side effects or results. And for those that are approved, a third are later found to have serious safety issues. So testing on animals as an indication for humans can be very misleading, either allowing dangerous drugs that looked safe on animals to be used in humans, or denying humans effective medications that were toxic in animals. So an example of this is paracetamol, used by all of us as a first-line pain relief, but absolutely fatal in cats. One of the most investigated fields in history is neurodegenerative disease, so Alzheimer's, dementia, stuff like that. And yet, despite some absolutely horrific experiments and literally billions of dollars spent, all we have to offer people are more or less the same treatments that we were offering decades ago. And nearly all the insights that we have found have been from human-based research, like advanced imaging and tissue assessment from patients. And what we need to understand is that whilst there are similarities between animals and humans, like, yes, we all have the same organs, we have similar tissue structure, things like that, we are ultimately different species and we function in different ways. A rabbit isn't a small human, and a person isn't a large mouse. We're different species. And only what we know to be true in humans can truly safely guide us on what we can do in terms of human medicine. So the other thing that we also need to consider is that many conditions that are investigated are unique to humans, or they're multifactorial with inputs like environmental and socioeconomic status playing major roles. So they can't actually be replicated accurately in animals. The very nature of being held in captivity, in isolation, in the state that they are, that affects the animals and the way that they manage the injury and the disease. And that's not an accurate representation of those diseases in humans who are free to live as they please. So overall, I would say the translation from animals to humans is poor at best.
That is a very great way to explain it. I've never quite heard it explained so succinctly, but yeah, that was excellent. And I can tell how much research and preparation you've done for the podcast today. So thank you for that.
I think it's one of those fields where the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And because it's so secretive, it's so hard to actually enlighten and educate yourself in this field. And that's one of our biggest struggles, trying to expose the data.
Now you have some current campaigns going. You're working to end primate experimentation in Australia. Can you tell us more about this effort and how it's progressing?
Yes. So like I mentioned earlier, primates are remarkably similar to humans. They are the closest to us genetically, and they possess similar cognitive, social, emotional, and functional abilities. So there's an assumption that any research results that are found to be true for primates are likely to be true for humans too. And the main kind of research we see them used for is in the field of neuroscience, and that generally means studying their brains. There are a few places in Australia that primate experimentation takes place, but the main one, I would say Monash University is the largest. They have a breeding and research facility in Gippsland, and at any given time they can have several hundred primates being held there.
I guess you've kind of touched on this a little bit in terms of alluding to the brain experiments, but can you please elaborate on why these experiments are particularly cruel and why it's so urgent that we need to stop them?
In my opinion, neuroscientific research is one of the most horrific for the animals, because to research the brain, the primates have to have their skulls cut open, their brains exposed and intentionally injured, which is about as invasive as it gets. If that wasn't enough, researchers then often screw heavy implants to their skulls to bolster them into position in future experiments. So not only does this monkey have to go through a terrible, painful surgery, it now has to live with this giant metal implant sitting on the top of its skull. And then if it couldn't get any worse, they have to perform for researchers in different challenges, sometimes just to earn their water rations. So there's that. And then because there is the potential for disease transmission between primates and staff, as well as the risk of aggression from the primates, the research staff handle these animals in such a way that is in itself quite violent. So the primates will often wear these large, heavy metal plates around their neck, which the staff use to hook them onto a pole, carry them in the air by the neck, and then throw them with great force into a chair where they're tied down into position for their next task. And they live with this big plate around their necks all their lives. It's just the saddest life.
Wow.
I'm sitting
Yeah.
here and I'm gobsmacked.
I can feel the tears welling, actually.
I'm
And this is standard procedure. This is literally standard operating procedure, which is adopted worldwide.
How can
How does that pass the ethics committee?
But how can people actually work in this industry? Like, I'm sorry, what sort of heartless, cruel monsters do we have in these research facilities who can treat animals, sentient beings like this? It blows my mind.
I think that just like in agriculture, people get desensitized quite quickly. And also in this field, people are convinced or brainwashed that they are serving some sort of higher purpose, saving human lives, when it just isn't the case. But because they carry that belief with them, they find some sort of inner strength to keep doing what they're doing, and then with time become desensitized. I don't think many people go in there with the intention of treating animals that way, but I think ultimately that's what ends up happening.
Yeah, it's just a consequence of the job description, I guess.
Yeah, here's your money. You keep going, do your job. But you're calling for a reform of the Australian Code. How would that help end the can't even talk at the moment, the primate testing?
Yeah, so in Australia, great apes, so gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans and bonobos, they're recognised as having the most advanced social and behavioural skills of all non-human primates. And being so similar to humans, they've been granted protections that essentially prevent them from being used for scientific purposes. The regulatory code states the complex and highly social behaviour and advanced cognitive capacity of many non-human primates makes it difficult to adequately provide for their needs in a captive environment or research setting. And then it goes on to say, there is concern that the compromise to their life associated with their confinement and use in scientific research may cause greater psychological suffering than with other species. So that's why they have those protections in place. And it is very true. But that was written over a decade ago, and our understanding of the sentience and cognitive abilities of all primates has increased enormously since it was drafted. So at AFSA, we're advocating for all primates to be given these same protections. And whilst that doesn't mean that there would cease to be primate experimentation entirely, it would mean that anything that doesn't directly benefit the animals involved would not be permitted, and that's the bulk of the research. So the end result would very much be in their favour. It's also really easy for people to empathise with animals that look and think and function very similarly to themselves. They can see their pain, they can see the fear in their face, whereas with other species like mice or rabbits, recognising these is much harder. And in this sense, it's a really low-hanging apple on the tree, and we also think it's a very achievable goal. And we intend to have a focus on this campaign in the near future, so watch this space.
Yeah, excellent. And we will put all of the links to your website and social media in the show notes so that people can, follow you and keep up to date with how they can help with this campaign.
Oh, yeah, gotta take a big breath here.
I thought I was prepared going into this role as a vet, and even I just spent the first few months just having my mind blown by what I was reading and seeing. And it happens every day. The more you uncover, the more you realise you haven't even touched the tip of the iceberg, and it's all done in secrecy, which is why we don't really know. People aren't aware. So that's what we're trying to expose here.
Yeah, and I think you're in a very unique position as a vet as well, because you have studied animals closely, their bodily functions, their behaviours, and so to know that information and then see what these animals are exposed to as well would probably weigh on you a lot more than the average person too.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really stood out for me when reading the studies that come out is that the actual veterinary care that the animals received gets next to no attention in the study. So the researchers are supposed to describe in their methodology all the materials and methods, and really go through every single aspect to the extent that if someone wanted to replicate their study exactly, they could using just that information. And yet the veterinary component it maybe gets 1 or 2 lines, or it might reference a procedure that was done 15 years ago that they're still copying. And if you go and try and find out that data, what they actually did for the animals, it's just so minimal. Like I would never consider even doing something to somebody's dog or cat with that level of analgesia and anesthesia. It's malpractice. But within the laboratory, it's considered standard practice and acceptable. So it's quite mind-blowing.
Oh, yeah, it's like everything that you're saying is just sort of hitting home and just hitting that
it's
raw
quite
nerve.
heavy. Yeah.
But I'm sort of looking at this next question, and I'm almost afraid to ask it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Another big focus recently has been uncovering disturbing studies involving traumatic brain injury and strangulation. So what did you discover?
Yeah, so this was the series of studies that I mentioned earlier from Monash University that were investigating intimate partner violence or domestic violence. So this is an important field of research. We want victims of IPV to have access to better treatments, of course. But this is a prime example of a condition or situation that simply cannot be accurately replicated in animals. And that's for several reasons. But the main one is that IPV is not just a physical condition. It's a complex, multifaceted issue involving socioeconomic, psychological, and cultural dimensions that just aren't applicable to animals. Also, for strangulation and traumatic brain injury, we already have superior methods available that don't require animals, such as human biomarker studies. This study that came from Monash University cost nearly $2 million in our tax money, which could have been spent on human-specific research that would actually help IPV victims. And of course, the study is performing violent crimes on animals, and even going so far as to recommend the model be used for future research in this field. It's preposterous that it was even approved in the first place for obvious ethical reasons, but scientifically it was also really weak, offering nothing for IPV victims, and it was a huge waste of our taxpayer money. We have tried to engage with the university about our concerns, and they outright disagreed with them. We submitted complaints of cruelty to Animal Welfare Victoria and have not gotten anywhere. And our problem of self-regulation and oversight is apparent here because there's no one else for us to turn to. No one to objectively investigate this or enforce any legislations. This is why trying to create change in this space is so hard for us. We will continue to campaign against this kind of violent research. And what we're hoping is that with increased exposure, we can put pressure on the university to stop these kinds of experiments, if not for the ethical reasons, then just to appease the general public, the majority of which do not support this kind of treatment towards animals, if only they were to know about it.
It is such a heavy experiment. You can't even imagine how that got approved. As you say, just, intimate partner violence is not something that animals experience. So it makes absolutely no sense to subject them to that.
And then you've got IPV victims sitting there saying, so you're trying to help victims of violence by perpetuating violence. Wow. How does that make sense?
I didn't even think of that.
I mean, exactly. It's so contradictory. And then in Australia, they're investigating the IPV through strangulation and traumatic brain injury, but in the UK, they've extended that to anal rape.
No.
So, yeah. So different parts of the world are going to be doing different things. So we haven't seen that in Australia, but that is within this field of research currently happening.
Wow.
And yeah, so like I said, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know, and the worse it gets.
Oh, I think we need to now move to the positive changes that you're advocating for. I mean, I take my hat off to you. I don't know if admire is quite the right word, but I'm sort of inspired by your dedication, your passion to bring this to the world. This is just, yeah, we need to get this out as far as we can. But let's move to something a little bit more positive. So what are some of the most promising non-animal methods that are being developed right now? So things like organ on chip, computer modeling, advanced cell cultures.
There's really so many. Organ on a chip is developing at a remarkable pace. Now they're able to link up multiple organs on a chip to create whole body systems. And they have a view to eventually creating a system like this that functions more like a whole organism. That would be like the ultimate goal. One space that we're seeing huge developments in right now is AI, which is coming up with completely new ways to research disease. So an example that I read that assessed histopathology samples from patients with endometrial cancer, and it was able to detect cancer with over 99% accuracy, whereas our existing methodologies had only 80% accuracy. And then that was also used in other forms of cancer like colorectal and breast cancer with the same level of success. And another example is being able to develop personalized treatments for people based on how their own tissue responds to different drug combinations, as opposed to giving everyone the same box of drugs. So it's quite revolutionary because it means that people can know what's going to work for them much, much, much faster. So we're really only seeing the tip of the iceberg in this space.
That's really promising. Getting a little bit personal here, but I have a very strong family history of breast cancer, and I actually carry the BRCA2 gene myself, and I've always been so conflicted about donating to breast cancer research or any other cancer research because I know that they often test on animals. So I think that all of these animal-free science methods are so promising, and I really can't wait to see how this develops, into the future, especially as something that, affects me personally. So if the science is there, what's stopping this shift to animal-free research? Is it funding? Is it politics? Or is it just the habit of the research community?
Yeah, it's probably a bit of all of that. At the moment, nearly all of the funding for research is streamed into animal research, and only a small percentage is being allocated to the non-animal methodologies, which we call NAMs. A lot of this has to do with the culture in medical research, where people have been taught that animal research is the gold standard in spite of all the data. And they'll even lose their professional standing or risk losing their professional standing just by trying to challenge this. And of course, no one likes change because that can be hard. So there is a cultural issue there. We've just seen the FDA in America announce that it's phasing out the regulatory requirement to test on animals for some drugs in development and to allocate more funding for the development of NAMs. And this strengthens our case for urgent policy change here. And we hope that it'll set a precedent for Australia to follow suit.
That's great that there's positive things happening across the globe that we can draw on and use as a positive example to phase these horrific experiments out.
Oh boy, this has been such an eye-opening episode, and as I keep saying, this needs to be heard by everybody. So in saying that, how can everyday people help advocate for animal-free science?
Honestly, just follow and support AFSA. We're the only ones in Australia working to affect change in this space, and we provide all the petitions, emails, campaigns, etc. needed to achieve it. So if you're not a member, join us or just consider donating. Anything helps. We are solely funded by donations.
I've also seen where people can sponsor a primate who has sadly been a victim of animal experimentation, and they can give them a name and really honour them. So I think that's such a beautiful thing that you guys do. I think that's what everyone's going to be getting from me for Christmas.
And they are real stories. We have a primate consultant working with us, and she worked really hard to obtain a lot of that data, and those are real experiences from animals. They're not made up. So we feel like by giving a name to these animals, we're giving back their dignity and we're personalizing them. They're not a number in a lab. They are real living sentient beings. So that's the idea behind there. So that's a really meaningful way to contribute if you're thinking of donating.
Very special.
So if you could wave a wand, if you had a magic wand in front of you and have people understand one thing about animal experimentation, what would it be?
That it's ineffective and not doing what people have been taught it is. So it's not saving human lives, and there are alternatives. And not only are they available, they're better, and they're likely to propel outcomes for human health much faster than animal research ever did.
Yep. Wow, we're really stuck in the dark ages with this one. Thank you so much, Dana, for coming on to the podcast and sharing your absolute wealth of knowledge. Can you just quickly round it out by telling us where our listeners can learn more and support you, or how they can get involved?
Sure. Just get online to our website, animalfreesci.org.au. We have tons of information and resources for anyone who wants to learn more or start advocating against this themselves. You can follow us on our socials, sign up for our monthly newsletter. Like I said, we're funded solely by donations from our dedicated supporters. So really every contribution counts and is greatly appreciated. The more people that are following us, the greater awareness we're going to have. And that is what leads to meaningful change.
We just can't thank you enough for being here and sharing both your story and the story of all the animals who are locked into these horrific conditions. So Dana, thank you so much for being with us today on the animal. I can't even remember the name of our podcast. I'm just so blown away. On the Vegan Compass podcast, we really appreciate your time, and we will do everything we can to help spread the message.
Thank you so much for having me and for giving us a platform to raise awareness about this.
Well, we could talk so much more about this, and I think that we will plan this for another future episode to delve into different aspects, because, as you said, when we were talking off camera, there is so much we could go into here. And, we've only just scratched the surface. So, yeah, I think we will give you a call further down the line and we will do another episode.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you so much.
Well,
Thanks,
folks,
Dana.
That brings us to the end of a pretty harrowing but fascinating, is that the right word?
Well, we're uncovering lots of information that we didn't know.
Yeah.
Traumatizing, insightful, great word.
And insightful, yes. So thanks for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you in our next episode. So bye from us.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Vegan Compass podcast, unveiling truths, inspiring change.
Be sure to follow us on social media at @thevegancompass_podcast. See you next time.